Hello and welcome back to Lesson 1, Part 2 of the Amateur Radio Technician License course. So let's begin. Again, I'm your instructor, Gary Stevens, Kilo Echo 2 Gulf Sierra. As a technician class licensee, you will have full privileges, 30 megahertz and above, and limited privileges in the HF bands. Now, there are issues with some of the bands, particularly people that are in the northern states, and that's that there are some non-amateur stations in those portions of the bands, and you have to avoid interfering with them. For example, the Canadian military uses 70 centimeters for a lot of their military operations. So you definitely don't want to interfere with the Canadian military. It would behoove you to know the band frequencies. For example, the 6 meter is 50 megahertz to 54 megahertz. And if you notice that there's a test question where 52.52 megahertz is a frequency within a 6 meter amateur band. So there were questions like that. So knowing the limits of the bands is something that you really should know. Another exam question is when your station is transmitting on 146.52 megahertz, you are using the 2 meter band. Another question, fixed digital messaging or message forwarding systems only is the limitation for the emissions of the frequencies between 219 and 220 megahertz. And by fixed digital message system, they're referring to something like the Internet Radio Linking project, which allows voice over IP connections to the Internet. There are various systems like Echolink that use this type of point-to-point mechanism. You're also expected to know some of the restricted portions of the band or the limited portions, such as the portions of the bands that are limited to CW or Morse code. So one of the questions that is on the exam is in the VHF UHF spectrum, the frequency ranges of 50 to 50.1 megahertz and 144.0 to 144.1 megahertz are limited to CW only. Another reason you want to pay attention to the band plan is the power limitations are listed. For example, 1500 watts is the maximum peak envelope power output for the technician class operators using frequencies above 30 megahertz, except for some specific restrictions. In the HF portion of the bands, the 10 meters is the only band that allows technician class operators to use phone or voice privileges. You should also note that you never want to put your transmitting frequency exactly on the edge of the band because there could be some error in your transmitter frequency display. There could be some modulation that extends beyond the point of the band edge, and your transmitter could just drift. So stay away from the edges, and we'll get into that a little bit further along the way. Now with your technician license, you can only use 10 meters for RTTY or data transmissions in the HF bands. And in the HF bands, you're also regulated on the max power output that you can have. You're limited to 200 watts on the 10 meter or HF band, as well as 15 meter, 40 meter, 80 meter for CW. So it's time that we need to introduce a concept, and that's a concept of repeaters. Now, a repeater is what it says in its name. It simply takes a signal and it repeats and sends it on. So imagine that we have two vehicles that are 50 miles apart, and there's a mountain in between them. Well, radio waves travel at the line of sight. That means that it goes just like light follows light. So if there's something between the two objects, like a mountain, it's not in line of sight. But we could use something like a repeater, which will accept the signal and then repeat it. So the way that this works is, say that the vehicle on the left wants to talk to the vehicle on the right, and they're 50 miles apart. And there's a mountain in the way. But fortunately, on the top of the mountain, there's a repeater. So the tower is within both line of sight of both vehicles. So the car on the left transmits on 144.83 megahertz. So its transmit is actually the receive side of the repeater, and so they're backwards. So it transmits on the input frequency of the vehicles. So the difference in those frequencies is called an offset. But the reason that we have to introduce the concept of a repeater is because we're about to talk about a repeater coordinator. So frequency coordination is just simply allocating repeater input and output frequencies to minimize the interference between repeaters that are in close proximity to each other, physically. So a frequency coordinator is just an individual or a group of people that recommends the repeater frequencies to reduce or eliminate interference. So you don't want repeaters in the same geographical area to interfere with each other. So the test question is, voluntary frequency coordinators recognized by local amateurs recommends transmit and receive channels and other parameters for auxiliary and repeater stations. Another question is, amateur operators in a local or regional area whose stations are eligible to be a repeater or an auxiliary station selects a frequency coordinator. The cardinal sin in radio is willful interference. And willful interference is basically someone who maliciously interferes or prevents other people from using the frequency. So holding down a transmit key in order to prevent other people from transmitting is one example. That's called dead key. So as long as the key is pressed, other people are unable to use the frequency as long as, if you're overpowering their signal. So that's the one thing that the FCC or other amateur operators will hunt you down like a dog if you do that. So do not do it. So the test question reads, at no time is willful interference to another amateur station permitted. So if you get caught causing harmful interference, the FCC can levy some pretty hefty fines, and they could also cause you to forfeit your equipment, or they will confiscate it. Now, to me and to many amateur operators, one of the exciting aspects is being able to talk internationally. So the question reads, as an FCC licensed amateur radio station, you are permitted to make the type of international communications that are communications incidental to the purpose of amateur radio service or remarks of a personal character. So don't try to talk bad about the government or their government, our government, or anything. Just keep it simple and on message about amateur radio, and all will be okay. Another question reads, when a foreign country authorizes it, you are allowed to operate your amateur station in a foreign country. There may be a few countries that don't allow you to operate, but it's fairly rare. As a FCC licensed amateur station, you may transmit from any vessel or craft located in international waters and documented or registered in the United States. One big no-no is not keeping your address current with the Federal Communications Commission. Um, and the question reads, revocation of a station license or suspension of the operator license may result when correspondence from the FCC is returned as undeliverable because the grantee failed to provide or maintain the correct mailing address with the FCC. And it's really simple to keep it up to date. There's an online system that allows you to go in and change it at will. One nice thing is that a license is good for 10 years. So the test question reads, 10 years is a normal term for the FCC issues primary station operator amateur radio license grant. And the government helps or bends over backwards to help you keep your license. So there's a 2-year grace period between when your license expired and when you have to renew it. So the question reads, 2 years is a grace period following the expiration of an amateur license within which the license may be renewed. And the FCC has stepped into the 21st century, so they have an online database. And they quit, as I mentioned earlier, they quit giving a certificate. So after passing your examination, you can go to the online database and find your name. You can do a search by name or by call sign. But the question reads, after passing the examination for your first amateur radio license, as soon as your operator station license grant appears in the FCC's license database, you can operate your transmitter on an amateur radio service frequency. And isn't that awesome? And while they're generous with a 2-year grace period, you're not allowed to operate your any transmitter while your license is expired. So the question reads, if your license is expired and is still within the allowable grace period, transmitting is not allowed until the FCC license database shows that your license has been renewed. And renewal is free, so other than just being absent-minded, there's no reason why not to renew it once you've earned your license. This test question reads that any country whose administration has notified the International Telecommunications Union, or ITU, that it objects to such communications are countries that the FCC licensed amateur radio stations are prohibited to exchange communications with. I believe at this time there are no countries that are on record as objecting, not even Iran or North Korea. However, in North Korea, amateur radio stations are prohibited from the people who live there, so your chances are you're not going to be talking to them. But if you do, that's perfectly legal. As a general rule, one-way transmissions are prohibited, but everything has an exception, it seems. So when transmitting code practice information, bulletins, or transmissions necessary to provide emergency communications, an amateur station may make one-way transmissions. So, continuing with exceptions, as a general rule, you're not allowed to encode messages that would hide their meaning. However, suppose that you are with a team and you launched a repeater into space, which would be like a CubeSat or some other amateur radio satellite. You don't want other people to control it because they crash it into the International Space Station, create an international incident. It could be bad. So it is permissible to encode or encrypt messages to a satellite in that case. So the question reads, it is permissible to transmit messages that are encoded to hide their meaning only when transmitting control commands to space stations or radio control craft, such as a drone. Another thing we're prohibited from doing as hams is to transmit music. However, the exception is if an amateur station is authorized to retransmit music using a phone emission when it's incidental to authorized retransmission of manned spacecraft communication. A lot of times with the International Space Station or space flights, they use music to wake up the astronauts. And as I said before, the amateur radio operator is not allowed to make any money. However, you can use the radio to announce station equipment that you have for sale. An example would be, say that you had a Yaesu FT 100A for sale. You can tell other amateur radio operators that you have that available. So the question that is asked reads something like, an amateur radio operator may use their station to notify other amateurs of the availability of equipment for sale or trade when the equipment is normally used in an amateur station, such as and such activity is not conducted on a regular basis. So you can't run an amateur radio store over the air, but you can sell your private equipment occasionally. Because amateur radio is on public airways, obscene language is banned. So the question reads, concerning transmission of language that may be considered indecent or obscene is such, or any such language is prohibited. So think before you speak. As we talked about before, when we're talking about repeaters, there are types of stations that can automatically retransmit signals. There's also auxiliary stations or space stations. Space station or satellite is really just a repeater. It's orbiting the Earth, or hopefully at some point in time we'll have some in stationary orbit. But the question reads, repeater, auxiliary, or space stations are types of amateur stations that can automatically retransmit the signal from another station, amateur station. I believe we've covered this one already. So the question is, when communication is incidental to classroom instruction at an educational institution, the control operator of an amateur station may receive compensation for the operating of that station. So human life and the protection of property trumps a lot of rules. So the test question goes something like this. Only when such communications are directly related to the immediate safety of human life or the protection of property are amateur stations authorized to transmit signals related to broadcasting, programming production, or news gathering, assuming no other means is available. A recent example of that was during the hurricane in Puerto Rico when all the power was out. It knocked down a lot of radio broadcast towers, and stations were out of service. There was no fuel for emergency generators, and amateur radio was the only way to get news in and out. So that's a prime example of what this question is talking about. In the FCC world, there are broadcast licenses, and then there's the amateur radio licenses. So broadcasting is when you have an audience out there and you have no expectation of them talking back to you. You're just transmitting to them. So the question reads, the term broadcasting in FCC rules for the amateur radio service refers to the transmission that are intended for reception by the general public. And the final question, or the topic for today, is the transmitting of signals using the remote control transmitters. Because of the nature of remote controlled or RC controlled planes or drones, you're not able to send a voice encoded or message, and a lot of those don't yield themselves to embedding a subaudible tone for your call sign. So to make allowances for that, all you need to do is place a sticker on your remote control with your call sign on it. So the question reads, when transmitting signals to controlled model aircraft, an amateur station transmit without on-the-air identification. So that's it for this lesson. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and we'll see you next time.